Have you ever stopped to think about how the world actually works? I mean, not just your own town or country with its traffic laws and local rules, but the entire planet. It turns out there's a kind of global rulebook. It's complex, it's fascinating, and yeah, sometimes it's a little messy, but it's the system that governs how we all get along. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on that system, international law. So, to get our heads around this, here's the game plan for our explainer. First, we'll start with the absolute basics. What even is law? Then we'll hit the biggest puzzle in global rules, something called the sovereignty problem. After that, we'll look at the two main ways nations get along, take a quick trip through history to see where these rules came from, and finally, we'll check out the major institutions that are on the world stage today. Okay, so let's start on our own doorstep. Before we can even begin to talk about law between countries, we've got to be on the same page about what law means right here at home. At the end of the day, it's a really simple question, isn't it? What is law? If you strip away all the complicated legal jargon, it really just boils down to a set of rules that a community agrees to live by, to keep things fair, safe, and running smoothly. Now, if you want the more, let's say, official definition, the Oxford English Dictionary says it's a system of rules that a country recognizes for its members. And, this is the important part, which it can enforce, usually by handing out penalties. That word, enforce, that's the key. So these ideas, protecting people, keeping things fair, solving problems without resorting to violence, this is what law is all about inside a country. But what happens when you get to the border, where one country's rules stop and another's start? And that very question brings us to our next section. And this is where things get really, really interesting. We're about to run headfirst into the biggest challenge in making rules for the whole world, the sovereignty problem. Think about it. Within your own country, law is connected to what we call a sovereign authority, a government, a parliament, some ultimate power that has the final say. This is your national law, or domestic law, and it covers everything from paying taxes to owning a house. It's the system that works inside the lines on the map. This slide just lays the problem out perfectly. On the one hand, you have national law. It's got teeth, it's enforceable by the state, but only within its own borders. On the other hand, you have this space between states. And out there, well, there's no world government. There's no global cop on the beat. This creates what experts call a state of anarchy. Now, that doesn't mean chaos and riots. It just means there's no higher authority. And that, right there, is the fundamental problem that international law was invented to solve. So how in the world do you create rules when everyone's their own boss? Well, it turns out two main types of international law grew up to handle this exact situation. One for just living together and one for actively working together. Okay, the first and the oldest type is what we call the law of coexistence. And honestly, the best way to think about it is exactly like this: respecting your neighbor's garden fence. It's the absolute basic rules of the road that allow countries to just exist next to each other without constant conflict. Don't invade your neighbor, respect their property, that kind of thing. It's the bare minimum for a peaceful world. And then you have the law of cooperation. This is a much newer idea. So if coexistence is all about respecting fences, cooperation is about two neighbors deciding, hey, let's build a bridge across that creek together. This is where countries choose to team up to tackle big problems that nobody can solve alone. We're talking about things like climate change, human rights, or global trade. Now, this is such a crucial point. Every state is basically expected to follow the law of coexistence. Respecting the garden fence is fundamental. But cooperation, that's totally optional. It only happens when countries voluntarily agree to it, usually by signing a treaty. And that single difference explains so much about world politics, from why it's so hard to get a global climate deal to the challenges of fighting a pandemic.
But of course, these ideas didn't just appear out of nowhere. They're the product of centuries of debate and trial, and a lot of error. So let's do a quick trip back in time and see how we actually got here.
This timeline really gives us the whole story in a nutshell. The very first seeds were planted way back in the 15th and 16th centuries with this idea of natural law. Then, a huge step forward in 1576 with the theory of sovereignty. That all led to the massive turning point in 1648, the Peace of Westphalia, which basically set up the world map as we know it. And then, tragically, the world wars of the 20th century put the need for cooperation into overdrive. So let's just touch on that first idea. Natural law might sound a little academic, but the core belief is actually pretty simple. It's the view that because all humans have reason, we can all figure out the basics of right and wrong no matter where we're from. It's this idea that there are some universal truths we can all agree on. Then this guy enters the picture, Jean Bodin. He was a French lawyer who, back in the 16th century, really put a name to this idea of sovereignty. He argued that within its own borders, the state had absolute and indivisible power. This was a game changer. It established the state as the top dog in its own territory, and that set the stage for pretty much everything that followed.
And that brings us to what a lot of people call the birthday of the modern world, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. This treaty ended a horribly brutal war in Europe. But more than that, it cemented the idea that the world is made up of independent, sovereign states. That principle is still the absolute foundation of our international system today. All right, on to our final section. We have all these big historical ideas. So how do they actually turn into real organizations you see on the news today? Well, the answer, for the most part, was forged in the fire of the 20th century. The real catalyst was catastrophe. The absolute unimaginable devastation of World War I, and then just a couple of decades later, the even greater horror of World War II. It made it painfully, terrifyingly obvious that the old garden fence rules just weren't enough anymore. So out of that rubble came a direct response. The world created brand new, ambitious global institutions. The most famous, of course, is the United Nations, born in 1945. For the very first time, the world had a permanent place to talk, to manage crises, and to really try and make that law of cooperation a reality. And, the UN was just the beginning. Today, there's a whole ecosystem of these international bodies, all built on that same drive to cooperate. You've got world courts like the ICJ and ICC, the World Trade Organization handling commerce, and even super deep partnerships like the European Union. And that quote really brings us full circle, doesn't it? We started out asking why we need law in our own towns. This idea suggests that without states to make and enforce rules, the world would just slide into chaos. And it leaves us with one last big question to think about. If law and order is so vital inside a nation, what's the best way to build it between them? That is the great ongoing challenge of international law.